Picture this. It's 1965. American soldiers on patrol near the demilitarized zone in Vietnam. The jungle is thick, the humidity oppressive. Suddenly, their commanding officer tells them something that sounds absolutely insane. The North Vietnamese army is using elephants to build bunkers. And there's a reward. Whoever brings down an elephant gets 2 days off on the hospital ship anchored in the Gulf. Now, you might be thinking, this sounds like something out of ancient history. Hannibal crossing the Alps. Alexander the Great conquering Persia. War elephants belong in history books, not in a modern 20th century conflict with helicopters, napalm, and jet fighters. But here's the thing. The Vietnam War was unlike any war that had come before it. And in the dense jungles of Southeast Asia, one of humanity's oldest weapons of war made its final appearance on the battlefield. Today, we're diving deep into one of the most fascinating and least understood aspects of the Vietnam War, the use of war elephants along the legendary Ho Chi Minh Trail, and the ingenious guerrilla tactics that allowed a technologically inferior force to hold off the most powerful military in the world. This is a story of innovation and adaptation, of ancient methods meeting modern warfare, of an underground city that became a weapon, and of how the Vietnamese people turned their greatest weakness into their greatest strength. The last war elephants in history. Before we get into the jungles of Vietnam, we need to understand something important. War elephants have been used in combat for over 3,000 years. From ancient India around 1100 BCE, these magnificent creatures were the tanks of the ancient world. They could charge through enemy lines, crush soldiers beneath their massive weight, carry heavy equipment across impossible terrain, and strike absolute terror into the hearts of those who had never seen them before. The first time Alexander the Great encountered war elephants during his conquest of Persia in the 2nd century BCE, he was mesmerized, not just by their size and power, but by what they represented, a force of nature that could be controlled and directed. He took the surviving Persian elephants and tried to build his own elephant army. Later, when he pushed into India and faced King Porus, he saw what fully trained war elephants could do in combat. His soldiers fought them off, but at a terrible price. Throughout history, elephants served in wars across Asia and Africa. The Carthaginians used them, the Romans faced them. Chinese armies encountered them in Southeast Asia. The Mongols dealt with them in Burma and India. As late as the 1800s, Burmese and Siamese armies were still deploying elephants in battle. The British in India used specialized elephant batteries to haul siege artillery over terrain where oxen couldn't go. But by the 20th century, with the advent of motorized vehicles and modern firearms, the age of the war elephant should have been over. Should have been. Yet in the mountains and jungles of Indochina, elephants would serve in one final conflict, the Vietnam War. Let's be clear about something right from the start. Elephants in Vietnam weren't being used like they were in ancient times. They weren't charging into battle with armored howdahs on their backs. They weren't being fitted with blade tusks to gore enemy soldiers. The role of elephants in Vietnam was far more practical, and in many ways, far more important. In May 1958, as tensions were rising in Southeast Asia, the North Vietnamese leadership knew they faced a massive challenge. They needed to supply communist forces and the Viet Cong guerrillas fighting in South Vietnam. But there was a problem, a big one. The country had been divided at the 17th parallel after the Geneva Accords of 1954. Moving troops and supplies directly south meant crossing the demilitarized zone, which was heavily watched and defended. The solution? The Ho Chi Minh Trail. This wasn't a single path. It was a massive, complex network of roads and trails that stretched through the mountains and jungles of Laos and Cambodia, running parallel to Vietnam. The North Vietnamese called it the Truong Son Strategic Supply Route, after the long mountain chain that separates Vietnam from Laos. Estimates of its total length vary wildly. The U.S. military suggested over 5,500 kilometers. The North Vietnamese claimed more than 13,000 kilometers. And in those early days, when the trail was first being developed, elephants were absolutely essential. Major General Nguyen Con Vinh of Hanoi's Central Military Committee envisioned a supply route that would be completely clandestine, hidden from enemy observation both on the ground and from the air. In 1959, Colonel Vo Bom and his unit, Military Transportation Group 559, began building this route. They started with 500 officers and men selected from the People's Army of Vietnam, 305th Brigade. The terrain they faced was brutal: dense jungle, steep mountains, rivers and streams, mud and rain. In the early stages, before the trail could be widened for trucks and motorized transport, they needed beasts of burden that could navigate this impossible landscape. Enter the elephants. Elephants were already part of Vietnamese culture, particularly in the Central Highlands. These weren't domesticated animals bred in captivity. The vast majority were captured from the wild and trained. Elephants had been used for agricultural work and logging throughout the region for centuries. They could literally rip trees out of the ground, clearing wide areas. They could carry enormous loads over terrain that would stop any vehicle, and they were intelligent enough to be trained for complex tasks. In the early days of the trail, from 1959 through the early 1960s, elephants were used to cross the Truong Son Mountains into Laos. They could carry up to 500 pounds of equipment, supplies, weapons, and ammunition. They could ford rivers that soldiers couldn't cross on foot. They could push through jungle so thick that machetes could barely cut a path. By the end of December 1959, the trail's capabilities were being put into action. 1,667 infantry weapons, 788 machetes and swords, 188 kilograms of explosives and other military supplies had been moved to guerrilla units throughout South Vietnam. And elephants played a crucial role in making that happen. But here's what's fascinating. As the trail developed and expanded, the role of elephants changed. By 1960, the trail extended deeper into Laos, and the segments began to widen. Bicycles were introduced into the transport network. Special bikes, mostly old French Peugeots, were reconfigured to allow riders to carry up to 500 pounds of equipment. Human porters with A-frames on their backs started moving supplies. And then came the trucks. By December 1961, the 3rd Truck Transportation Group of the People's Army of Vietnam's General Rear Services Department became the first motor transport unit to work the trail. Soviet, Chinese, and Eastern Bloc, trucks started moving supplies. The trail was being motorized, but elephants didn't disappear. They continued to serve in areas where trucks couldn't go, in the deepest jungle, on the steepest mountain paths, during the wet season when roads became impassable. Throughout the 1960s and early 70s, the Ho Chi Minh Trail became one of the most sophisticated logistics networks in military history. The National Security Agency later called it one of the great achievements of military engineering of the 20th century. And elephants remained part of that achievement. The 559 Transportation Group, which maintained the trail, created an entire infrastructure. Camouflaged roads, supply caches, storage dumps, barracks, maintenance facilities, hospitals, command and control centers. By 1970, anti-aircraft guns ran nearly the entire length of the trail. An estimated 67,000 North Vietnamese military personnel served in Laos alone just to operate the trail system. The numbers of supplies moving south were staggering. In 1964, 20 to 30 tons per day. By 1965, 90 tons per day. At the height of the war, 60 tons of equipment and 20,000 soldiers per month were being transported. What took 6 months to traverse in the early days could be done in 6 weeks by the late war period, and less than a month by 1970. And through all of this, elephants continued their work. American intelligence reports from the CIA show they were tracking elephant movements. The agency, they even invented a special device called the elephant counter for Laotian trail watchers who couldn't read or write. It featured pictograms representing troops, trucks, motorcycles, carts, bicycles, tanks, cannons, and yes, elephants. A common beast of burden in Laos. But the Americans weren't just counting elephants, they were hunting them. U.S. fighter jets and attack helicopters received orders to target any elephant suspected of aiding the communists. A New York Times story from 1966 tells of such a massacre. United States Marine pilots strafed a column of 11 pack elephants. 5 of the animals were killed, and 5 others were seen to fall. This wasn't just military pragmatism. It was strategic. Every elephant killed was one less crucial logistics asset for the North Vietnamese. One less way to move ammunition and supplies to the fighters in the south. One less advantage the enemy had in terrain where American vehicles couldn't operate. Veterans' accounts paint a vivid picture of this strange aspect of the war. Reconnaissance teams reported convoys of elephants carrying provisions. When skeptical analysts back at headquarters mocked these reports, one team brought back incontrovertible evidence: a plastic bag full of elephant dung, dumped soft and squishy on the analyst's desk. Penny Evans, a donut dolly in Vietnam, saw elephants in 1970 in the town of Ban Mae Thuot in Dak Lak in the Central Highlands. American veterans working in Vietnam as civilians from 1959 to 1965 reported it was not unusual to see domesticated elephants at work in the Central Highlands. One organized a hunt from elephant back, though his elephant wouldn't stand still long enough to get a shot at anything. The South Vietnamese forces also used elephants. ARVN troops in the Central Highlands occasionally deployed them for counter-guerrilla patrols. They would hire local elephant handlers to help them cross deep rivers or haul heavy equipment when conventional transport was unavailable. And then there was Operation Ballroom, one of the most bizarre military operations involving elephants in history. In 1968, a group of U.S. commandos facilitated the airdrop of 2 elephants from a CH-53 helicopter. The elephants were for a local tribe in Vietnam's Central Highlands that needed the animals for farm tasks. Yes, this actually happened. And yes, there's a movie based on it, though with some Hollywood embellishments. But despite all these efforts, despite the bombing and the strafing and the destruction, the elephants kept working. They were resilient. They could survive in conditions that would kill a truck. They didn't need fuel or spare parts. They could forage for food. And in the dense jungle where American technology often failed, these ancient weapons of war proved their worth one final time. A Vietnamese officer's account, preserved in the book War Elephants by John M. Kistler, notes that troops became deeply devoted to these animals. They would hesitate to abandon their elephants even during intense battles. The elephants weren't just tools, they were companions, partners in an impossible struggle. By the time the Vietnam War ended in 1975, the age of war elephants was essentially over. The last significant use of elephants in combat now exists only in Myanmar, where the Kachin Independence Army still maintains a corps of about 4 dozen elephants for logistics in terrain where vehicles cannot operate. But for the rest of the world, the elephants of Vietnam mark the end of a 3,000-year tradition. The elephant population in Vietnam paid a terrible price for this final chapter. Wild elephants used to roam throughout much of southern and central Vietnam. Flora and Fauna International estimated there were about 1,500 to 2,000 in 1975. By the early 1980s, only about 500 remained. By 2000, that number had dropped to just 114. Today, fewer than 85 wild elephants remain in Vietnam. They suffered first at the hands of ivory poachers and hunters, then from American bombing campaigns that targeted them as military assets, and finally, from the encroachment of farmers and loggers destroying their forest habitats. The elephants that helped win the war became one of its countless casualties. But the story of elephants in Vietnam isn't just about logistics and supply lines. It's a perfect metaphor for the entire conflict. A technologically superior force with all the advantages of modern warfare, facing an enemy that adapted, that used every resource available, that turned traditional weaknesses into strengths, that fought smart instead of fighting fair. And nowhere was this more evident than in the guerrilla tactics that defined the Vietnam War. The art of guerrilla warfare. If you want to understand why America lost the Vietnam War, you need to understand guerrilla warfare. The term comes from the Spanish word meaning little war, and it describes a form of irregular warfare where small mobile groups of combatants use hit-and-run tactics, ambushes, sabotage, raids, and surprise attacks against a larger, less mobile traditional military force. The Viet Cong, the guerrilla forces fighting in South Vietnam, didn't invent guerrilla warfare, but they perfected it. They took principles from Mao Zedong's successful insurgency in China. They learned from their own experience fighting the French during the First Indochina War, and they adapted everything to the specific conditions of Vietnam: the terrain, the climate, the people, the enemy they faced. The result was one of the most effective guerrilla campaigns in history, a campaign that frustrated, demoralized, and ultimately defeated the most powerful military force on Earth. Let's start with the basics. The Viet Cong, or VC, were the military branch of the National Liberation Front, an outlawed communist party in South Vietnam. They were commanded by the Central Office for South Vietnam, located near the Cambodian border. For arms, ammunition, and special equipment, they depended on the Ho Chi Minh Trail, but many of their other needs were met inside South Vietnam itself. The Viet Cong consisted of a mix of fighters. There were main force units, professional soldiers who saw themselves as part of a revolutionary army, and there were local guerrilla groups, often young teenagers. Many were motivated by ideology. Others had been pressured or shamed into joining. Some harbored real doubts about their ability to fight heavily armed and well-trained American soldiers. But what they lacked in equipment and training, they made up for in knowledge, adaptability, and sheer determination. The first principle of Viet Cong guerrilla warfare was simple. Avoid battle unless you have numerical superiority and good chances of success. In the Vietnam War, most VC units spent only a limited number of days per year actually fighting. While they might be forced into an unwanted battle by an American or South Vietnamese action, most of their time was spent on other activities: population control, training, intelligence gathering, propaganda, building fortifications. On average, Viet Cong troops fought only 1 day in 30. Think about that. In essence, they fought on the ground only when they wanted to fight. This mastery of initiative made the American strategy of attrition extremely problematic. The Americans wanted big battles, large-scale engagements where superior firepower could inflict maximum casualties. But the VC simply refused to cooperate. When they did fight, they followed specific tactical principles. The most important was the doctrine of 1 slow, 4 quick. 1 slow referred to preparations, careful intelligence gathering, detailed planning, rehearsals. The 4 quick referred to quick advance, quick attack, quick clearance of the battlefield, and quick withdrawal. Attacks were carefully scaled based on numerous factors: the political situation in an area, the strength of enemy forces, the terrain, the likelihood of success. Every engagement was planned with multiple echelons. Local guerrillas might conduct preliminary tasks, diversionary attacks, clearance of certain areas through mining and booby traps. Sappers, special assault troops, might infiltrate and demolish key objectives. Then the main force would attack, and a blocking force would be positioned to ambush any relief troops rushing to the battle area. The Viet Cong became masters of specific tactics, hit-and-run maneuvers where they would strike fast and disappear before reinforcements could arrive, ambushes where they would strike from hidden positions and then melt back into the jungle, and perhaps most effectively, hugging tactics, where they fought close to American troops, so close that American artillery and air support couldn't be used without risking friendly fire. They also developed tactics specifically designed to neutralize American firepower. In the Battle of Ia Drang in 1965, one of the first major engagements between U.S. and North Vietnamese forces, the VC used hugging extensively. They moved rapidly parallel to the line of ambush, sliding along its length and presenting harder targets for American counterattack. While U.S. firepower caused significant losses, these methods showed a force that was learning, adapting, and growing more proficient. Time always favored the communist forces. Sanctuaries in Laos, Cambodia, and North Vietnam were always available, and they were forbidden to U.S. ground attack for political reasons. After every battle, no matter how successful for the Americans, the ARVN and American forces would eventually have to move on, and the VC would regroup and return. The Viet Cong also pioneered what the Americans called nuisance mining. Instead of well-defined minefields that could be detected and cleared, they scattered mines and booby traps throughout entire areas. Mines were usually installed at night by trained personnel with detailed knowledge of the terrain. Through ingenious techniques in mine warfare, the Viet Cong successfully substituted mines and booby traps for artillery. Instead of conventional minefields covered by fire, they hindered or prevented the use of supply roads. They inhibited off-road operations by planting explosive devices in indiscriminate patterns. While this directly caused combat casualties, vehicle losses, and delays in tactical operations, the psychological effect was equally important. Just knowing that a mine or booby trap could be anywhere slowed combat operations. It forced Allied troops to clear almost the entire Vietnam road network every day. About 100 Americans died every week from these guerrilla methods: mines and booby traps, surprise attacks, snipers, small unit ambushes. It was death by 1,000 cuts, a war of attrition where the side that could endure the longest would win. The Viet Cong soldiers themselves were specifically trained for this type of warfare. They had extensive knowledge of the local jungle, which helped them ambush the enemy. They wore everyday civilian clothes, so U.S. forces couldn't identify them. This wasn't just practical camouflage. It violated the laws of war that required combatants to be clearly identifiable, but it was brutally effective. Hiding in plain sight among peasants, it was very hard to tell them apart from ordinary civilians. They usually carried Soviet AK-47 assault rifles. This was a simple weapon to use, but very accurate, and it could weather the watery terrain of the jungle. They traveled light with small rations of rice, enabling them to move quickly through the jungle. They carried tools to make punji sticks and other booby traps, and they had no headquarters. Operating in small, well-armed groups made them extremely difficult to find. The Viet Cong followed rules that sound simple, but were devastatingly effective when applied consistently. Retreat when the enemy attacks. Attack when the enemy retreats. If the enemy stays in place, harass them. If the enemy withdraws, pursue them. They would disappear like water into sand, then emerge when conditions were favorable. But perhaps the most important aspect of VC guerrilla warfare wasn't tactical, it was strategic. The Viet Cong understood that this was fundamentally a political war, a war for the support of the South Vietnamese people. They implemented a strategy of people's war inspired by Mao Zedong's principles of insurgency, building power from the countryside to the cities, using a mix of conventional and guerrilla warfare to achieve victory. Sometimes this meant winning hearts and minds through propaganda and social programs. Sometimes it meant terror and intimidation to gain local support. Not all Vietnamese people supported the actions of the Viet Cong, but the combination of ideological appeal, practical benefits, and fear of retribution created a network of support throughout South Vietnam. American forces struggled to counter this. General William Westmoreland's strategy was based on attrition. He called it search and destroy. American forces would search out the enemy, make contact, and then, with superior numbers and firepower, destroy them. The idea was that eventually the communists would reach a point where they could no longer replace their battlefield losses. Having been ground down, they would presumably agree to a favorable peace settlement. But the search and destroy tactics proved ineffective in the fluid guerrilla war. Most battles of the war were sharp, brief engagements between units of fewer than 200 men. Many lasted only a few hours, often only a few minutes, but they could result in heavy casualties, and the VC controlled when and where these engagements happened. Some large-scale operations were mounted to destroy communist base areas and supplies. Operations like Cedar Falls and Junction City involved up to 1,000 U.S. troops, supported by hundreds of sorties by helicopters and fighter bombers. Though they yielded large quantities of captured weapons and supplies, they were ultimately indecisive. The U.S. forces would invariably have to move on, and the VC would return. To deny the VC the use of dense forest to conceal their movements and hide their supply lines, the U.S. Air Force sprayed millions of gallons of a herbicide, called Agent Orange. It was effective in killing vegetation, but only at the price of causing enormous ecological damage and exposing thousands of people to toxic chemicals that would cause serious, sometimes fatal health problems for decades. Along the DMZ, the Americans established a string of fortified bases with electronic warning devices, minefields, and infrared detectors designed to check infiltration from the north. The North Vietnamese responded with periodic artillery attacks and ground assaults on U.S. outposts at Con Thien, Gio Linh, Camp Carroll, and Khe San. In 1967, a study called PROVN, Program for the Pacification and Long-Term Development of South Vietnam, concluded that U.S. efforts should be concentrated on providing security and stability for the rural population. It suggested that attrition would not work as an effective counterinsurgency strategy. At the time, military commanders largely dismissed it. The continued emphasis on overwhelming firepower and search and destroy missions amounted to an almost wholesale rejection of its recommendations. This was the fundamental problem. The Americans were fighting a conventional war against an unconventional enemy. They measured success in body counts and territory controlled. The VC measured success in political support and American casualties. They didn't need to win battles. They just needed to not lose, to keep fighting, to make the cost unbearable. Washington declared that the war was being won. But American casualties continued to mount, and much of what the public could see on television appeared confusing, if not futile. By 1968, with the Tet Offensive, the contradictions would become impossible to ignore. But even with all these tactics, the Viet Cong had another weapon. One that became legendary. One that symbolized their guerrilla war like nothing else. The tunnels. The underground war. If there's one image that captures the Vietnam War from the Vietnamese perspective, it's the Cu Chi tunnels, an immense network of connecting underground passages located in the Cu Chi district northwest of Saigon, part of a much larger network that underlay much of South Vietnam, a vast underground city where thousands of people lived, worked, fought, and died. The Cu Chi tunnels are one of the most extraordinary military engineering achievements in history. They became a tourist attraction after the war, a memorial to Vietnamese resilience and ingenuity. But during the war, they were a nightmare for American forces, a source of endless frustration, and a key factor in the Viet Cong's ability to survive and fight despite overwhelming enemy firepower. Let's start with the basics. The tunnel network at Cu Chi was approximately 75 miles long. That's 121 kilometers of underground passages, but the full network extending throughout South Vietnam was far larger. Some estimates suggest tens of thousands of miles of tunnels were dug by communist forces during the war. The construction began long before American involvement. Communist forces started digging tunnels under the jungle terrain of South Vietnam in the late 1940s, during their War of Independence from French colonial authority. These early tunnels were basic, hiding spots, short passages connecting positions. But they worked. They allowed Vietnamese fighters to move unseen, to appear and disappear, to survive. French artillery and air attacks. When the Americans arrived with even more devastating firepower, the tunnels became essential for survival. As the United States relied heavily on aerial bombing, North Vietnamese and VC troops went underground. In heavily bombed areas like Cu Chi, people spent much of their lives below the surface. The tunnels grew to house entire underground villages, complete with living quarters, kitchens, ordnance factories, hospitals, and bomb shelters. In some areas, there were large theaters and music halls to provide entertainment for troops and their supporters. Famous Vietnamese singers and show business stars were whisked from cities into the tunnels to perform for weary soldiers and keep morale up. It was a complete society, underground, hidden from the most technologically advanced military in the world. The tunnels were dug by hand, no machinery, just hose, baskets, and incredible determination. Vietnamese soldiers excavated the hard, reddish-brown laterite clay with simple hand tools. Some sections were dug over decades. 30 miles of tunnels were constructed by the Viet Minh between 1948 and 1954, just in the Cu Chi area. Then the Viet Cong continued and expanded them. The design was sophisticated. The system was built on multiple levels, often featuring 3 distinct layers. The tunnels were deliberately narrow and twisting. They were designed for the smaller stature of Vietnamese soldiers, making them difficult for larger American troops to navigate. The average tunnel entrance was just large enough to squeeze through. Some were so narrow that only someone familiar with them could pass. Defensive engineering was paramount. The system included cleverly camouflaged entrances. You could stand right on top of one and never know it was there. Trapdoors were made of wood and covered with leaves and brush, blending perfectly into the jungle floor. Some entrances were hidden inside termite mounds or beneath kitchen shelters. Others were disguised as natural features of the landscape. Inside, the tunnels contained intricate booby traps, bamboo traps with spikes, tripwires that would set off grenades, boxes of scorpions or venomous snakes positioned to fall on intruders, false tunnels that led to dead ends or traps, passages that could be flooded to seal off sections from enemies. The tunnels also had special ventilation shafts disguised as termite mounds or natural foliage. These provided fresh air without revealing the tunnel locations. The ventilation was crucial because the tunnels could become filled with smoke from cooking fires or poison gas pumped in by Americans trying to flush out the occupants. Some sections even had filtration systems and trapdoors that could seal off areas to prevent gas from spreading. Life in the tunnels was incredibly difficult. Air was scarce, food was limited, water was rationed. The tunnels were infested with ants, venomous centipedes, snakes, scorpions, spiders, and rodents. American soldiers used the term Black Echo to describe the conditions within the tunnels. It was dark, dank, claustrophobic, and terrifying. Most of the time, Viet Cong soldiers would spend the day in the tunnels, working or resting, and come out only at night. At night, they would scavenge for supplies, tend their crops, or engage the enemy in battle. During periods of heavy bombing or American troop movement, they might be forced to remain underground for days at a time. But despite these hardships, the tunnels gave the Viet Cong enormous advantages. They could control where and when battles took place. By helping to covertly move supplies and house troops, the tunnels allowed fighters to survive, prolong the war, and increase U.S. costs and casualties. The tunnels served multiple functions. They were communication and supply routes connecting different areas. They housed weapons caches and rice stores. They contained hospitals where wounded soldiers were treated and operations performed. They had sleeping chambers with bamboo beds. They had meeting rooms where commanders planned attacks. Some sections even had wells for drinking water. And most importantly, the tunnels were perfect for launching surprise attacks. VC soldiers could pop up through a trapdoor, fire at American troops, and be back underground before anyone could react. They could set ambushes, plant mines, and disappear into the earth. It was like fighting ghosts, an enemy that was everywhere and nowhere. Throughout the war, the tunnels in and around Cu Chi proved to be a source of enormous frustration for the U.S. military. The Viet Cong had been so well entrenched in the area by 1965 that they could control the tempo of the fighting. Just 40 kilometers from Saigon, the capital of South Vietnam, the VC had an underground fortress that allowed them to threaten the city itself. The Americans tried everything to destroy the tunnels. They declared Cu Chi a free fire zone. Nearly 50,000 tons of bombs were dropped on the region. B-52 bombers carpet-bombed suspected tunnel locations. The area became the most heavily bombed place on Earth. But the tunnels continued to operate. Bombing was largely ineffective. Even 750-pound bombs landing 50 yards from a tunnel entrance had no effect on either the tunnel or the entrance itself. The layered construction and hard-packed clay absorbed the shock. Tunnels more than 6 feet underground were essentially safe from anything except a direct hit. They tried pumping tear gas or smoke grenades into the tunnels, but the larger networks had ventilation systems and the ability to seal off sections. The gas would dissipate or be filtered out. They tried pumping water into the tunnels. Same result. The VC could seal off flooded sections and continue operating. They tried sending dogs into the tunnels, but the dogs couldn't avoid booby traps. They tried using chemical agents to contaminate the tunnels, but again, the sectional design and ability to seal areas made this ineffective. In 1966, Operation Crimp was launched. 8,000 troops from the U.S. 1st Infantry Division, the 173rd Airborne Brigade, and troops from the 1st Battalion Royal Australian Regiment attempted to defeat the Viet Cong in the Cu Chi district. It was the largest operation to date. The Viet Cong were ready. Despite being heavily outnumbered, many of them teenagers or younger, they held their ground. Underground, space was limited. 1 or 2 fighters who knew the tunnel layout could hold up a force and inflict casualties out of all proportion to their numbers. The Viet Cong set snipers above ground, while their main force remained hidden below. The Americans and Australians had difficulty finding any enemy. They encountered mines, foxholes, trenches, and caves, but of Viet Cong, there were almost no sightings. There was little fighting of the type expected in a major offensive, and even when it became apparent that the enemy was in tunnels beneath their feet, the Americans had no effective way to deal with it. During Operation Crimp, Australian troops found caches of ammunition, food, and numerous booby traps in the tunnels. By the time the operation ended on January 14, 1966, the number of Australian dead in Vietnam had doubled from 8 to 16. Behind them, the Australians and Americans left empty and burnt villages. The populations had been relocated, but within months, the VC had returned to the tunnels. 1 year later, around 30,000 American troops launched Operation Cedar Falls, a massive offensive in the Binh Duong province north of Saigon, an area known as the Iron Triangle. After bombing attacks and defoliation with powerful herbicides, U.S. tanks and bulldozers moved in to sweep the tunnels, driving out several thousand residents, many of them civilian refugees. It was the largest American ground operation of the war to that point. And on January 18, 1967, tunnel specialists uncovered something extraordinary: the Viet Cong district headquarters of Cu Chi. It contained 500,000 documents concerning all types of military strategy. Maps of U.S. bases, detailed accounts of troop movements from Cambodia into Vietnam, lists of political sympathizers, plans for assassination attempts. It was an intelligence bonanza. But it didn't stop the tunnels. Within months, the VC had slipped back. And in early 1968, they would use the tunnels as a stronghold in their assault on Saigon during the Tet Offensive. The Americans eventually developed a specialized response. They created elite teams of volunteers trained in the art of tunnel warfare. These specialists became known as tunnel rats. And they deserve their own part of this story, because what they did was absolutely insane. The tunnel rats imagined being asked to crawl into a pitch-black hole in the ground. You know it's an enemy tunnel. You know there are Viet Cong soldiers down there, armed and waiting. You know the tunnel is rigged with booby traps, punji stake pits with sharpened bamboo designed to impale you, grenades tied to tripwires, venomous snakes tethered in the darkness, poison gas that could be released at any moment. The tunnel is so narrow you can barely fit. You're on your hands and knees, or crawling on your belly. It's hot, humid, and the air is foul. You can't see more than a few feet in front of you, even with a flashlight. The tunnel twists and turns. There are false passages, dead ends, sudden drops. You're completely alone, no backup, no support. Just you, a pistol or knife, a flashlight, and a piece of string to mark your path. And you volunteered for this. That was the job of a tunnel rat. And there were only about 100 of them in the entire U.S. Army in Vietnam. Most either died in the tunnels or in ambushes on the surface. They were some of the bravest soldiers in the entire war. The tunnel rats were created out of necessity. When American forces realized that bombing and gassing the tunnels wasn't working, they needed a new approach. In 1966, Captain Herbert Thornton, a chemical corps officer with the 1st Infantry Division responsible for contaminating tunnels with chemical agents, created specialized teams to enter, clear, and exploit the tunnels. The requirements for becoming a tunnel rat were simple. You had to be small, preferably under 5'6" and slim build. The tunnels were designed for Vietnamese soldiers, who were generally smaller than Americans. A large soldier simply couldn't fit in many of the passages. You had to volunteer. No one was forced to do this job. You had to be brave, or maybe crazy. Most tunnel rats operated independently. They would typically enter a tunnel alone or in pairs. Some went in armed only with a flashlight and a knife. The reason? In the close confines of a tunnel, gunfire would be deafening and disorienting. Muzzle flash would temporarily blind you, and the noise could cause a tunnel collapse. Many tunnel rats preferred a .45 caliber pistol or a sawed-off shotgun for close combat. But most of the time, if they encountered an enemy soldier face-to-face in the darkness, it came down to hand-to-hand combat. The job was incredibly dangerous. Beyond the enemy soldiers, the booby traps were everywhere. The VC were masters of improvised weapons. They would fashion punji stakes, sharpen bamboo spikes coated with feces or poison to cause infection. These were hidden in pits covered with thin matting and leaves. Step or crawl on it, and you'd fall onto the spikes. Tripwires were strung across passages. Touch one and a grenade would detonate. Or a board studded with nails would swing down from the ceiling. Or a section of tunnel would collapse, burying you alive. The VC also used snake pits. They would catch venomous snakes, bamboo vipers, or cobras, and tether them in sections of tunnel. In the darkness, you might not see the snake until it struck. Some booby traps were psychological. The VC would leave bodies of dead American soldiers in the tunnels, positioned to look alive in the dim light. Or they would set up dummies that would trigger when disturbed. The constant fear of what might be around the next corner, in the next chamber, was as effective as the traps themselves. The work was methodical and painstaking. A tunnel rat would mark his route with string or engineer tape to find his way back out. He would feel ahead carefully for tripwires. He would listen for sounds of enemy movement. He would sketch maps of the tunnel layout, noting chambers, intersections, and important features. If he found supplies or documents, he would mark the location for retrieval. Sometimes tunnel rats would encounter enemy soldiers. The encounters were brief and brutal. In the confined space, there was nowhere to run, no room to maneuver. It was kill or be killed. Some tunnel rats carried knives with brass knuckles built into the handle for close combat. Others relied on their pistols despite the risks. When a tunnel rat found a major cache or important documents, he would mark it and withdraw. Then engineers would come in with explosives to demolish that section, or intelligence officers would retrieve documents for analysis. The goal wasn't always to destroy the tunnels. Sometimes it was to gather intelligence about enemy plans and movements. But the Viet Cong learned to adapt. They began posting soldiers specifically to guard important tunnel sections. They set more sophisticated traps. They created false tunnels that looked important, but were actually death traps. They flooded sections to make them impassable. They created U-bends in tunnels that would fill with water, creating an effective seal. Some tunnel complexes became famous among American forces. The Cu Chi tunnels were the most notorious, but there were others. The Iron Triangle, War Zone C, War Zone D. Each had extensive tunnel networks that frustrated American operations. The psychological toll on tunnel rats was enormous. The darkness, the claustrophobia, the constant threat of death from traps or enemy soldiers. Many suffered from what would later be recognized as post-traumatic stress disorder. Some refused to go back into the tunnels after particularly harrowing experiences. Others became addicted to the adrenaline rush and kept volunteering. Sergeant Robert Baer was one of the most famous tunnel rats. He conducted over 300 tunnel explorations. He survived countless encounters with enemy soldiers and booby traps. He once found himself face-to-face with a Viet Cong soldier in a tunnel so narrow they couldn't raise their weapons. They fought with knives in total darkness. Baer survived. The VC soldier didn't. Another tunnel rat, Sergeant Arnold Gutierrez, described finding a VC field hospital in a tunnel complex. It had operating tables, surgical instruments, wounded soldiers being treated. He withdrew and called in engineers to seal the section. The psychological impact of sealing wounded men underground haunted him for years. The tunnel rats developed their own culture and traditions. They wore unofficial uniforms, often just shorts and boots, to deal with the heat. They carried personal talismans and lucky charms. They had their own slang and code words, and they had a bond that only those who had been in the tunnels could understand. By the late 1960s, American forces had developed better tactics for dealing with tunnels. They used ground-penetrating radar to map tunnel systems. They employed tunnel denial teams that would pump acetylene gas into tunnels and ignite it, creating explosions that would collapse large sections. They brought in specially trained dogs that could detect tunnel entrances, but none of these methods were as effective as the tunnel rats. Only by physically entering and mapping the tunnels could American forces truly understand their extent and importance. And only by capturing documents and supplies from the tunnels could they gather intelligence about enemy operations. The toll on tunnel rats was heavy. Of the estimated 100 or so who served, casualty rates were extraordinarily high. Some sources suggest that fewer than 10% survived the war without injury. Many were killed by booby traps. Others were killed in firefights underground. Some died when tunnels collapsed on them. A few were simply never seen again, lost forever in the darkness beneath the Vietnamese jungle. After the war, many tunnel rats struggled with the memories, the darkness, the fear, the violence. Some refused to talk about their experiences for decades. Others found solace in connecting with fellow tunnel rats who understood what they had been through. Today, the Cu Chi tunnels are a major tourist attraction in Vietnam. Visitors can crawl through specially widened sections of the original tunnels. They can see the trap doors and the chambers. They can experience for a few minutes what it was like to be underground. But the tourist tunnels are sanitized, widened, lit, safe. Nothing like what tunnel rats faced. The real tunnels, the ones that haven't been modified, are still there. Narrow, dark, dangerous. A testament to the ingenuity and determination of the Viet Cong, and a reminder of the courage of the tunnel rats who entered them. The Tet Offensive. Guerrilla tactics on a grand scale. By late 1967, the Vietnam War had reached a stalemate. The Americans were winning most battles. Body counts showed the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese army suffering far heavier casualties than American and South Vietnamese forces. General Westmoreland was telling Washington that the enemy was on the verge of collapse. That victory was within reach, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. The American public was being assured that the war was being won. President Lyndon Johnson's administration pointed to statistics: territory controlled, weapons captured, enemy killed. By every conventional measure, the United States was winning. And then came Tet. The Tet Offensive, launched on January 30th, 1968, was the largest military operation conducted by either side up to that point. It was a coordinated series of surprise attacks by the Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces against more than 100 cities and towns throughout South Vietnam. It was timed to coincide with Tet, the Vietnamese New Year, traditionally a time of ceasefire. The offensive was a tactical defeat for the Communists. They suffered enormous casualties. Most of their objectives were not achieved. They failed to hold any of the cities they attacked. They failed to spark a popular uprising against the South Vietnamese government. By conventional military standards, it was a disaster for the Viet Cong, but it was a strategic and political victory. It shattered the illusion that America was winning the war. It exposed the weakness of the South Vietnamese government. It demonstrated that the enemy could strike anywhere, anytime, even the American embassy in Saigon. And it turned American public opinion decisively against the war. The planning for Tet demonstrated everything the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong had learned about guerrilla warfare. The offensive was planned in absolute secrecy. Weapons and ammunition were smuggled into cities and towns weeks in advance, hidden in Buddhist pagodas, buried in rice paddies, concealed in civilian homes. VC soldiers infiltrated urban areas disguised as civilians. Peasants coming to the cities to celebrate Tet. The attacks were coordinated across the entire country, from the DMZ in the north to the Sa Mau Peninsula in the south. Simultaneous attacks on over 100 targets. It required sophisticated planning and communication, and it was achieved using the same guerrilla tactics that had frustrated American forces in the jungle: deception, surprise, initiative. In Saigon, 19 VC commandos attacked the American embassy compound. They blasted through the outer wall with explosives and fought for 6 hours before being killed or captured. None of the attackers survived. They never made it inside the main building. But the images of American soldiers fighting on the grounds of their own embassy were broadcast around the world. The psychological impact was devastating. If the enemy could attack the embassy itself, the symbol of American presence and power in Vietnam, then no place was safe. The optimistic assessments from military commanders suddenly seemed hollow. In Hue, the ancient imperial capital, Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces captured most of the city and held it for 25 days. The Battle of Hue became one of the longest and bloodiest battles of the entire war. House-to-house fighting. Urban combat at its most brutal. American and South Vietnamese forces eventually retook the city, but at a terrible cost. Much of the historic city was destroyed. During their occupation of Hue, the Communists executed thousands of South Vietnamese civilians, government officials, police officers, teachers, anyone associated with the South Vietnamese government. Mass graves were discovered after the battle. The Hue massacre became one of the darkest chapters of the war. At Khe Sanh, a remote combat base near the DMZ, North Vietnamese forces had been conducting a siege since January 21st, 9 days before the main Tet Offensive. The siege lasted 77 days. It became an obsession for President Johnson, who feared another Dien Bien Phu, the French defeat in 1954 that ended French colonial rule in Indochina. The Americans held Khe Sanh through massive air support. B-52 bombers dropped thousands of tons of ordnance on North Vietnamese positions. The amount of firepower directed at the area around Khe Sanh was staggering. More bombs were dropped on the approaches to Khe Sanh than were dropped on Japan during all of World War II. But historians now believe that Khe Sanh was a diversion. The North Vietnamese never intended to overrun the base. They wanted to fix American attention and resources on a remote outpost while preparing for Tet. And it worked. American commanders were so focused on Khe Sanh that they missed the signs of the coming offensive. The Tet Offensive showcased every guerrilla tactic the communists had developed. Urban warfare using civilian cover. Surprise attacks timed for maximum psychological impact. Coordinated operations across vast distances. Propaganda and psychological warfare. The willingness to accept enormous casualties to achieve strategic objectives. Militarily, the communists paid a terrible price. Estimates of VC and NVA casualties during Tet range from 30,000 to 50,000 killed. The Viet Cong in particular were devastated. Many of their best units were destroyed. Their infrastructure in many areas was shattered. It would take years to recover. But strategically, Tet was a turning point. American casualties during the offensive shocked the public. Over 1,500 U.S. soldiers killed, many more wounded, and the realization that after years of war and billions of dollars, the enemy could still launch a nationwide offensive changed everything. CBS News anchor Walter Cronkite, the most trusted journalist in America, visited Vietnam after Tet. When he returned, he delivered a special broadcast on February 27, 1968. He concluded that the war was unwinnable, that the only rational way out was to negotiate, not as victors, but as an honorable people who lived up to their pledge to defend democracy and did the best they could. President Johnson reportedly said, "If I've lost Cronkite, I've lost Middle America." Within weeks, Johnson announced he would not seek re-election. The political will to continue the war was evaporating. Tet demonstrated the ultimate effectiveness of guerrilla warfare. You don't have to win battles. You don't have to control territory. You don't have to have superior firepower or technology. You have to make the cost of victory unacceptable to your enemy. You have to break their will. And the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong understood this from the beginning. The human cost and the long war wars are won and lost, not just on battlefields, but in the hearts and minds of people. The Vietnam War was fundamentally a war of attrition, not just military attrition, but political and psychological attrition. The question was never whether America could win battles in Vietnam. The question was whether America had the will to keep fighting long enough to achieve victory. The Vietnamese communists understood this. They had fought the French for 9 years before achieving victory at Dien Bien Phu. They were prepared to fight for another 9 years, another 19, another 29, however long it took. They were fighting for their country on their soil. The Americans were fighting a war half a world away. The human cost on all sides was staggering. Estimates of total deaths vary, but most historians accept the following figures. Between 1 million and 3 million Vietnamese combatants and civilians died during the war. American deaths totaled 58,220. South Vietnamese military deaths were over 200,000. Deaths among other Allied forces, including South Korea, Australia, and Thailand, totaled around 5,000, but numbers don't capture the reality. Every one of those deaths was a person, a son or daughter, a brother or sister, a husband or wife, a parent, someone whose life was cut short, someone who experienced fear and pain and loss. The Viet Cong and North Vietnamese forces suffered horrific casualties. In battles like Ia Drang, Khe Sanh, and Hamburger Hill, American firepower inflicted massive losses. A common saying among U.S. soldiers was that the enemy would send 10 men to kill 1 American, and they'd keep sending until they succeeded. There was truth to this. The North Vietnamese leadership was willing to accept casualty rates that would have been politically impossible for the Americans. Vietnamese soldiers often carried letters to be delivered to their families if they died. Many wrote poems and last messages. They knew the odds of survival were low, but they also believed they were fighting for a cause that justified the sacrifice: independence, unification, freedom from foreign domination. For American soldiers, the war was different. Many were draftees. Many didn't understand why they were there. The war had no clear front lines, no territorial objectives, no sense of progress. You would fight for a hill, lose men taking it, then abandon it and watch the enemy. Retake it a week later, the same villages would be pacified and lost, and pacified again. The guerrilla nature of the war meant constant stress. You couldn't trust anyone. The farmer working in the rice paddy might be VC. The child on the street might be carrying a grenade. The village you passed through peacefully yesterday might ambush you today. This created a paranoia and suspicion that sometimes led to atrocities. The My Lai massacre in March 1968 was the most infamous example. American soldiers from Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 20th Infantry Regiment, murdered between 300 and 500 unarmed South Vietnamese civilians, men, women, children, and infants. The soldiers had been told the village harbored Viet Cong. They found no enemy fighters, but they massacred the villagers anyway. The massacre was initially covered up by the army, but investigative journalist Seymour Hersh broke the story in November 1969. The revelation shocked America and the world. It became a symbol of the war's moral corruption. Lieutenant William Calley, who led the massacre, was eventually convicted of murder, but many felt the punishment was inadequate, and that responsibility extended up the chain of command. My Lai wasn't the only atrocity. Both sides committed war crimes. The Viet Cong executed civilians they considered collaborators. They used terror tactics against villages that didn't support them. They placed mines and booby traps that killed and maimed indiscriminately. The North Vietnamese tortured American prisoners of war, violating the Geneva Conventions. But the Americans were supposed to be the good guys, fighting to defend democracy and freedom. The revelation of massacres and atrocities undermined the moral justification for the war. If American soldiers were killing innocent civilians, how were they different from the enemy? The guerrilla nature of the war contributed to these atrocities. When you can't tell enemy from civilian, when every village might harbor fighters, when your buddies are being killed by mines and ambushes, the line between military necessity and murder becomes blurred. This doesn't excuse the atrocities, but it helps explain how they happened. For the Vietnamese people, both North and South, the war was a catastrophe. Millions became refugees, fleeing the fighting. Entire villages were destroyed. Farmland was devastated by bombs and chemical defoliants. The economy was shattered. Families were divided, with brothers fighting on opposite sides. The tunnels at Cu Chi and throughout South Vietnam became more than military installations. They became refugees for civilians. Entire families lived underground to escape the bombing. Children were born in the tunnels. People died there from disease, malnutrition, and the constant stress. One Vietnamese woman who lived in the Cu Chi tunnels as a child later recalled that she didn't see the sun for 2 years. Her entire childhood was lived in darkness underground. She suffered from malnutrition and disease. She'd lost siblings to American bombing, but she survived. These stories of survival are remarkable. The resilience of the Vietnamese people, their determination to endure, was extraordinary. Whether they supported the communists or the South Vietnamese government, or just wanted to be left alone, they endured hardships that would have broken most societies. The use of herbicides like Agent Orange had long-term consequences that continue today. The chemicals cause cancer, birth defects, and other serious health problems. Millions of Vietnamese were exposed. So were American servicemen who handled the chemicals or operated in sprayed areas. The effects are still being felt in both countries. The bombing campaigns left Vietnam covered with unexploded ordnance, bombs, artillery shells, mines, grenades. Even today, more than 50 years after the war ended, people are killed and injured by these remnants. Farmers plowing fields, children playing, construction workers. The war's deadly legacy continues. The endgame, Paris Peace Accords and the fall of Saigon. By 1969, the United States was looking for a way out. President Richard Nixon, who took office in January, promised peace with honor. His strategy was Vietnamization, gradually withdrawing American troops while building up South Vietnamese forces to defend themselves, continuing to provide air support, weapons, and advisors, but letting the Vietnamese fight their own war. At the same time, Henry Kissinger, Nixon's national security advisor, began secret negotiations with the North Vietnamese in Paris. The public peace talks that had been going on since May 1968 were making no progress. Both sides were more interested in propaganda than negotiation. But, in secret, Kissinger and North Vietnamese Politburo member Le Duc Tho worked toward a settlement. The negotiations were difficult. The North Vietnamese demanded complete withdrawal of American forces and the removal of South Vietnamese President Nguyen Van Thieu. They wanted unification under communist rule. The Americans wanted to preserve an independent South Vietnam. They wanted the return of American prisoners of war, and they wanted a ceasefire that would allow them to withdraw with honor rather than in defeat. Meanwhile, the war continued. American ground forces gradually withdrew, but the bombing intensified. Nixon extended the war into Cambodia in 1970, launching ground operations to destroy North Vietnamese sanctuaries and the Ho Chi Minh Trail segments that ran through Cambodian territory. This led to massive protests in the United States and further erosion of support for the war. In 1972, the North Vietnamese launched the Easter Offensive, also called the Spring Offensive, or the Nguyen Ho Offensive. It was a conventional military campaign, not guerrilla warfare. Over 120,000 North Vietnamese troops with tanks and heavy artillery invaded South Vietnam across the DMZ, from Cambodia and from Laos. The offensive was partially successful. The North Vietnamese captured several provincial capitals. But American air power, including massive B-52 strikes, helped South Vietnamese forces halt the advance. The offensive cost the North Vietnamese enormous casualties, perhaps over 100,000 killed and wounded. But it demonstrated that the South Vietnamese army, despite years of American training and billions of dollars in equipment, still couldn't defend itself without American support. It also increased pressure on both sides to reach a settlement. The North Vietnamese realized they couldn't win a quick military victory. The Americans realized that Vietnamization wasn't working. Neither side could achieve their maximum objectives. Compromise was necessary. In October 1972, Kissinger and Le Duc Tho finally reached an agreement. A ceasefire would take effect. American forces would completely withdraw. American prisoners would be released. The political future of South Vietnam would be determined later through negotiations between the North and South. But South Vietnamese President Thieu refused to accept the agreement. He saw it as a sellout. The agreement allowed North Vietnamese forces to remain in South Vietnam. It didn't guarantee the survival of his government. He demanded changes. Nixon backed Thieu and demanded modifications to the agreement. The North Vietnamese refused. The negotiations stalled. In December 1972, Nixon ordered Operation Linebacker 2, the Christmas bombing. For 12 days, B-52 bombers pounded North Vietnam, dropping over 20,000 tons of bombs on Hanoi and Haiphong. It was meant to force the North Vietnamese back to the negotiating table and to reassure Thieu that America would support South Vietnam. The bombing worked, at least partially. The North Vietnamese returned to negotiations. Minor changes were made to the agreement. Kissinger told Thieu that the U.S. would cut off all aid if he didn't sign. Thieu reluctantly agreed, though he later said he felt betrayed. The Paris Peace Accords were signed on January 27, 1973. The war for America was over. Within 60 days, all American troops were withdrawn. American prisoners of war were released, but North Vietnamese troops remained in South Vietnam. The South Vietnamese army was left to continue the fight alone. The Paris Peace Accords didn't bring peace. They brought a pause. Fighting continued between North and South Vietnamese forces. But without American air support and advisors, the South was at a severe disadvantage. The guerrilla war had evolved into a conventional war. And in conventional warfare, the North had numerical superiority and the advantage of shorter supply lines. By 1974, the North Vietnamese were preparing for a final offensive. They rebuilt the Ho Chi Minh Trail as a modern highway. They moved tanks, artillery, and massive supplies south. They planned a conventional invasion. In March 1975, the offensive began. It was supposed to be a 2-year campaign, but South Vietnamese resistance collapsed faster than anyone expected. Province after province fell. The South Vietnamese army disintegrated. Soldiers deserted. Officers fled. Panic spread. President Nixon had promised South Vietnamese leaders that if the North violated the peace accords, America would respond with air power. But Nixon had resigned in August 1974 because of the Watergate scandal. President Gerald Ford wanted to help, but Congress refused to authorize military action. The American public was done with Vietnam. There would be no intervention. On April 30th, 1975, North Vietnamese tanks crashed through the gates of the Independence Palace in Saigon. The war was over. South Vietnam ceased to exist. The country was unified under communist rule. It was renamed the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The final days were chaotic. Over 100,000 South Vietnamese tried to flee. Many were former officials, military officers, people who had worked with the Americans. They feared retribution under communist rule. The American embassy organized helicopter evacuations from the roof. The images of helicopters lifting off with desperate people clinging to the skids became iconic. Many South Vietnamese didn't make it out. They were sent to re-education camps, prison camps where former officials and military personnel were imprisoned for years. Hundreds of thousands spent years in these camps. Some died there, many more suffered. Others tried to escape by boat. The boat people became a humanitarian crisis. Hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese refugees fled in small boats across the South China Sea. Many drowned. Many were killed by pirates. Many died of starvation and dehydration. But many also made it to refugee camps in Thailand, Malaysia, Hong Kong, and the Philippines. From there, many were resettled in the United States, Australia, France, Canada, and other countries. The Vietnam War was the first war America lost. It had profound effects on American society and foreign policy. It created a generation of veterans who felt abandoned and betrayed. It led to the end of the draft and the creation of an all-volunteer military. It made Americans skeptical of military intervention. The Vietnam Syndrome, the reluctance to commit American forces abroad, influenced U.S. foreign policy for decades. For Vietnam, unification came at a terrible price. The country was devastated, infrastructure destroyed, economy ruined, millions dead, land poisoned with chemicals and littered with unexploded ordnance, families divided and destroyed. The communists had won. But the peace they promised didn't materialize. Economic policies failed. The government became repressive. Hundreds of thousands fled as refugees. Relations with the United States remained hostile for years. It wasn't until the 1990s that relations began to normalize. Economic reforms improved living standards. Trade resumed. American veterans began returning to Vietnam, seeking closure, healing old wounds. Legacy and lessons. So, what can we learn from the use of elephants and guerrilla tactics in the Vietnam War? What does this strange and tragic chapter of history teach us? First, technology isn't everything. America had every advantage: air superiority, artillery, advanced weapons, helicopters, electronic surveillance, chemical defoliants, the most powerful military in history. And it wasn't enough to defeat an enemy that was technologically inferior, but strategically superior. The Vietnamese understood that they didn't need to match American firepower. They needed to avoid it, to survive it, to outlast it. The guerrilla tactics, the tunnels, the hit-and-run attacks, the refusal to fight on American terms. All of this was about negating American advantages. And elephants, those ancient weapons of war, symbolized this perfectly. In an age of helicopters and jet fighters, the Vietnamese used elephants to move supplies through terrain where technology failed. They adapted, they improvised, they used every resource available, traditional and modern, ancient and contemporary. Second, wars are won by will as much as by weapons. The North Vietnamese and Viet Cong were willing to accept casualties that would have been politically impossible for the United States. They were fighting for their country, for unification, for independence from foreign domination. They had fought the French for 9 years. They were prepared to fight the Americans for as long as it took. The Americans were fighting a limited war with limited objectives in a place most Americans couldn't find on a map. When casualties mounted and victory seemed impossible, public support collapsed. The anti-war movement grew. Political will evaporated. The Vietnamese didn't break the American military. They broke the American will to continue fighting. Third, understanding the enemy and the terrain is crucial. American forces often fought blind. They didn't understand Vietnamese culture. They didn't speak the language. They couldn't tell friend from enemy. They didn't understand the guerrilla tactics they faced. The tunnels at Cu Chi existed for years before Americans fully understood their extent and importance. The Ho Chi Minh Trail was bombed relentlessly but never shut down because it was a network, not a single road. Destroy one segment and supplies would be rerouted. The Vietnamese adapted faster than the Americans could respond. Fourth, guerrilla warfare works when the guerrillas have popular support, or at least acquiescence. The Viet Cong couldn't have survived without help from the Vietnamese people. Villagers provided food, shelter, and information. They hid weapons and ammunition. They warned of approaching enemy forces. They dug and maintained the tunnels. Some of this support was voluntary, motivated by ideology or nationalism. Some was coerced through intimidation and violence. But, without it, the guerrilla war couldn't have been sustained. American efforts at winning hearts and minds through civic action programs and rural development were always competing against fear of VC reprisals and resentment of foreign occupation. Fifth, there are no good options in counterinsurgency warfare. The Americans faced an impossible dilemma. If they used overwhelming firepower, they killed civilians and drove people to support the guerrillas. If they restrained firepower, they took higher casualties and prolonged the war. If they relocated villages to separate people from guerrillas, they created refugees and resentment. If they left villages in place, the VC controlled them. Every tactic had negative consequences. Search and destroy created destruction without lasting results. Pacification was slow and vulnerable to VC counterattack. Bombing campaigns devastated the landscape, but didn't break enemy will. There was no military solution to a fundamentally political problem. Sixth, the cost of war extends far beyond battle casualties. The Vietnam War's effects continue today. American veterans suffer from PTSD, exposure to Agent Orange, and the psychological wounds of fighting a war their country didn't fully support. Vietnamese civilians deal with unexploded ordnance, birth defects from chemical exposure, and divided families. The elephant population in Vietnam was nearly wiped out. The war poisoned American politics and society for a generation. It created distrust of government and military leaders. It divided families and communities. It left scars that haven't fully healed. For Vietnam, decades of war, first against the French, then against the Americans, devastated the country. Economic development was set back by decades. The post-war communist government's policies compounded the damage. Only in recent decades has Vietnam begun to recover and prosper. Finally, the Vietnam War reminds us that warfare is ultimately about human beings. The soldiers who fought, the civilians who suffered, the families who lost loved ones. Behind every statistic is a person. Every casualty was someone's child or parent or spouse. The tunnel rats crawling through the darkness. The Viet Cong soldiers living underground for years. The American draftees counting days until they could go home. The South Vietnamese soldiers fighting for a government many of them didn't believe in. The North Vietnamese soldiers marching south knowing they probably wouldn't return. The civilians caught in the middle, just trying to survive. And yes, even the elephants, those magnificent creatures that had served in wars for 3,000 years, pressed into service one final time, bombed from the air, hunted by helicopters, casualties of a war they couldn't understand. Conclusion: the Vietnam War was many things. A Cold War conflict, a nationalist struggle, a civil war, an anti-colonial fight, a tragedy. And in the midst of all this, war elephants made their last appearance in history, and guerrilla tactics reached perhaps their highest level of sophistication. The image of elephants carrying supplies through the jungle, while B-52s dropped bombs from 30,000 feet above, captures the war's contradictions. Ancient and modern, David and Goliath. A technologically advanced superpower, unable to defeat a determined adversary, fighting on their home ground, with inferior weapons but superior strategy. The tunnels at Cu Chi still exist. You can visit them today. Walk through the widened passages, see the trapdoors in the chambers. It's a tourist attraction now, a memorial. But standing at those tunnel entrances, you can imagine what it was like. The darkness, the fear, the determination of those who built them and lived in them, and the courage of those who entered them as enemies. The Ho Chi Minh Trail is mostly overgrown now. Parts have been turned into highways, parts parts have been reclaimed by jungle, but in some places you can still see the old roads, the bomb craters, the remnants of the war, and you can imagine the columns of supplies moving south, trucks and bicycles and porters with A-frames. And yes, elephants, always the elephants, carrying their loads through the mountains and jungle, patient, enduring, until they couldn't anymore. The Vietnam War ended nearly 50 years ago. The veterans are elderly now. Many have passed away. The Vietnamese people have built a new country, prosperous and growing, though still ruled by the Communist Party that won the war. Relations between the United States and Vietnam have normalized. Americans visit as tourists. Trade flourishes. The old animosities have faded, though the memories remain. But the lessons of Vietnam remain relevant, about the limits of military power, about the effectiveness of guerrilla warfare, about the importance of understanding your enemy, about the cost of war, about the resilience of the human spirit. War elephants are gone from the battlefield forever. Their 3,000-year history ended in the jungles of Vietnam, but their story, and the story of the guerrilla war they were part of, reminds us that warfare is about adaptation and innovation, about using every resource available, about never giving up. The Vietnamese communists won not because they had better weapons or more soldiers. They won because they outlasted their enemy, because they adapted to circumstances, because they used ancient methods and modern tactics, because they understood that wars are won in the mind as much as on the battlefield. From the elephants carrying supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail to the tunnel rats crawling through darkness beneath Cu Chi, from the guerrilla fighters striking and disappearing to the conventional armies that ended the war. The Vietnam conflict shows us that military victory isn't always the same as strategic success, that technology doesn't guarantee triumph, and that the human cost of war is always higher than we want to admit. This was the story of war elephants and guerrilla tactics in Vietnam, the last chapter in a 3,000-year history, the ultimate test of ancient methods against modern warfare, and a reminder that in war, as in life, it's not always the strongest who survive. Sometimes it's the most adaptable, the most determined, the ones who refuse to give up no matter the odds. Thank you for watching.